25% of all the greenhouse gases on the planet are produced from agriculture. Carbon, but also nitrous oxide. So it's not just distribution that's an issue. It's how we grow the food. And again, the inefficiencies and waste. Farms are very leaky. Water pollution, these hypoxic dead zones in places like the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. That's fertilizer washing off the farms, not being taken up by the plants, creating these nutrient-rich waters that then become oxygen deprived. So it's distribution, but it's also impact.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, back today, got somebody who, this is going to be great because we're going to be talking about biodiversity. We've got somebody who is a PhD in ecology up there at the University of Guelph. We've got Andrew MacDougall. How's that?
Perfect. Hey, Chris.
Well, thanks for coming. Well, let's just start off in a basic way. Just tell me, how did you get interested in ecological matters, environmental matters?
Well, there's several levels to that, but the biggest thing is I just like being outside, and I wanted to find a career that would get me in the woods. So that's what I did. I do enjoy research, the scientific process. So yeah, I had a range of things that I did. I worked as a government biologist. I ran my own company for a while, but eventually I got into academia and been teaching here at the University of Guelph for 15 years. Mm. Wow. And we mostly do research on various aspects of global change, how the world is shifting and what that means ecologically. The maintenance of plant and animal diversity, clean air, clean water in the environment, whatever it might be. Ecology encapsulates all of that.
A radical idea, clean air, clean water. Wow. Do you remember earlier in life, was there a moment that nature kind of appealed to you? You thought, oh yeah, I like this is interesting.
Oh, for sure. It's usually, I don't know, teenage trauma and going for a walk in the woods and finding it comforting. My dad was identical. I mean, it's kind of bogus from a scientific perspective, but that was my own personal connection to the natural world. It meant something to me personally, and then I was inspired or motivated to go study it. That not every academic starts like that, but that was certainly the case for me, always, and yeah. It's still to this day.
And not all science approaches it with the respect towards nature. A lot of science is revolved around manipulating nature, and so you kind of take a different approach, yeah?
There's a wide spectrum, but a lot of it can be quite clinical. And there's nothing wrong with that, right? Very reductionistic, precise ways of trying to study the world versus more immersive, emotional ways of trying to connect with it and understand it. They both can work. Science is typically the former, the more clinical. I try to do both as best I can. The experiential part of being in the woods, but also, yeah, sure, the rational academic side as well. Try to marry the two.
Right. I mean, there's a lot of indigenous people who the methods that they use, scientists study later and say, whoa, they were onto something here and they didn't even know it. So there can be a connection towards the more scientific to the more spiritual, I think.
Well, 100%. Yeah, no, the integration. I mean, one of the challenges, I think, with ecology historically, even back when I was super young, I think there was this idea I had to go to the most remote places of the planet to truly understand how nature worked, right? The Serengeti or the Arctic or the rainforest. And not only do we not think that anymore because the interface between humanity and nature is, under attack, so to speak. Mm. But of course, none of those areas were ever truly free from people. The Serengeti, we're understanding about the rainforest and ancient civilization and so forth. There's always been interface. So yeah, now that's the pursuit, is to look at our relationship with the natural world, how we affect it, how we depend on it. So that's clean air, clean water, writ large, if you will.
I think the last 200 years is we really took a left turn at Albuquerque and just went, the other.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say even since the 1930s, there was some social and technological things that happened, mechanization after World War I. From an agricultural perspective, the ability to manufacture nitrogen fertilizer, which is great for bombs, right? So the Oklahoma City bombing was nitrogen fertilizer. That was developed after World War I, of course. But that combination of mechanization and fertilization in the 1920s really kicked off an agricultural revolution in the 1930s that persists to this day. And that's really been the biggest driver of all the good things that, experience in the global north, shelter, the ability to feed ourselves, but it's had a huge impact on the environment. And that's what we're wrestling with now is we can't keep living like that. How can we redesign with the way we live, how we impact the environment?
Yeah. What do they call that? The Haber-Bosch or?
Yes, that's right.
Something like that, where they just, the
process of nitrogen, of creating nitrogen fertilizer, you mean?
Yeah. And
yes.
Went from wanting to make bombs to, and I think the Germans are the ones that figured it out or whatever, but
yeah.
And then,
that's right.
But then, you get these population booms and you can't, there's a lot of talk about overpopulation, underpopulation. The more mouths you got to feed, we built a population on a agricultural system that's not really good,
No, it's pretty inefficient. I mean, this is one of the things that might give me hope is that we can increase our efficiency profoundly. Food waste, we've all heard statistics, 25% of all the food we grow, we waste. It might be bigger. If we just eliminate food waste, the impacts of agriculture on the planet drop by like 20% because we don't have to grow as much food and the cropping footprint reduces. So things like that, we're right now pretty inefficient. We can clean things up. That's, I think, going to be the future, is tightening up how we support ourselves on the planet. And the question is, can we do that?
I lived off the excess of American life by hitchhiking and living the vagabond lifestyle for a long time. And that would be great compost if you could use, but it doesn't go to the compost. It just gets lost in transit or whatever. So
for sure. Oh yeah. Well, my mom grew up, influenced by the Depression and World War II. And so she grew up being very efficient. She's got the world's smallest ecological footprint, as I always say, which is why I had hand-me-down clothes in high school, which was always something that embarrassed me. But she grew up with a very limited amount of, she'd get one orange for Christmas, for example, was a big deal. So she lived with an efficiency that we don't even recognize today.
Yeah.
But that maybe we should return to some degree. So you'd see the same thing, hitchhiking and being in a part of the world, part of our society that doesn't consume as much, either because they can't or because they choose not to, or both, right?
Yeah.
So
when you give them the choice, humans will stuff their gob as much as they can. But my great uncle was very similar in the sense that he lived off his land. He grew food, he pickled stuff. And the generation that came after had no idea how to pickle anything.
That's right. Oh my God, my grandmother's chutneys, and some of it was good, a lot of it was too salty or whatever it could be, but that's the way you did it, right? You grew stuff in the garden in your summer, you preserved it and ate it over the winter. My mom still does that. She grows all her own vegetables, except now instead of chutneys, she puts it in the deep freeze.
Also good,
but it's the same concept. Yep.
Well, God bless the older folks, because we need to pivot back that direction probably. So you also studied something called trophic island biogeography and its impact on fragmented landscapes. What is that? Tell me about that.
Well, it's part of, there's a number of things that we look at in our research group that all sort of stems from environmental change and the human impact on landscapes. And of course, one of the big drivers of change is fragmentation of habitat loss. So we look at, we're creating a landscape of islands, right? Crop fields that surround small patches of forest or grassland or wetland or whatever it might be. So we look at how the numbers of species diversity is regulated within some of these patches. And so island biogeography are basic rules that predict how islands are populated by species, right? And it's usually about how isolated the island is and how big it is. Trophic island biogeography also recognizes this idea of food web interactions, predators and prey, and so forth. All a trophic dependency is just an obvious thing that, so our big predators tend to disappear first from landscapes, right? Lions and cheetahs and grizzly bears and so forth. And one of the challenges for them is they're so dependent on their prey to persist. A trophic dependency is the predator doesn't show up till the prey gets there first. And so that's all that means is that if you're talking about let's say a new habitat island that you're trying to restore in a landscape and you didn't just colonize this naturally, the predators are the last thing that show up because they can't get there until everything else is there first, if that makes sense.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
So that was the idea. Yeah.
Anything incredibly surprising about studying these kind of, biodiversity groups?
Anything surprising? Well, we use model systems of insects. But what the most surprising thing to me is that predatory insects follow exactly the same rules as lions and cheetahs and the big charismatic carnivores, which makes sense. But the equivalent of a lion in the insect world is as limited by prey as the lion itself, right? So there are universal laws, it seems, on these assemblies of communities when you think about what eats what.
Yeah.
So as with insects, so with African Serengeti.
Yeah. I mean, it could almost parasitic in a way where they just want to eat off of other people instead of I have so much respect for herbivores, because they're making use of people. I'm vegan, so it's like,
right.
Come on, guys.
Looking at insects community, it's brutal. Like the parasitism in particular, things like there's a katydid or a grasshopper is obviously a big herbivore, but there's specific parasitoids that are huge. And they capture these crickets, capture them alive, lay their eggs inside them alive, and the eggs hatch and eat them from the inside out. And it's pretty brutal in the natural world when you look at it closely. So, yeah.
Yeah. That's the stuff like that. The cuckoo, the cuckoo shoves the eggs out of the nest and has the other bird. Disturbing stuff. Being humans, I would hope that we're smart enough to never take on that role because, it's embarrassing to live that way. That's why I went vegan. I'm one of those vegan idiots now. So can you explain what's the invasion paradox and how does your research on the global drivers of species invasion, how do they get to reconcile it?
No, absolutely. So there are major drivers of change, and certainly one of them are biological invasions. And we work on that as well. As with habitat fragmentation, so with invasion, there's all sorts of cool fundamental ecological stories that emerge out of that. And with invasion, one of the cool things is invasion probably shouldn't happen. Right? They typically are rare, isolated founder events. A seed is accidentally transplanted from Europe to North America on the back of somebody's shoe or whatever it might be. So they're rare events, small number of individuals arriving into an environment they have no adaptive familiarity with, interacting with plants and animals that have been there for generations and are well adapted. Based on that alone, every single invasion should fail, right? So the invasion paradox is it doesn't. It's a phenomenally widespread phenomenon, especially in certain parts of the planet, not all. But yeah, that's the paradox. It should fail, it works. And not only does it work, it's a runaway freight train of disaster in some spots, like Australia or California, parts of South America.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, if you'd never call them invasive issues if they died right away, right? If they succeed, then they become a problem. Are there examples that strike you as far as some of the most infamous? You mentioned Australia, like the cane toad. Are there other examples?
Yeah, cane toad, absolutely. Oh, there's lots. I mean, I'm a plant person, so most of my examples come from there. But there's a species called crested wheatgrass, which occurs through almost all of Western North America, unless it's too cold or too deserty. Bromus tectorum, cheatgrass, is another one, and that occurs both in the American Southwest as well as Australia. And some landscapes now can be dominated almost 100% by these guys. And again, their ancestral origins are parts of Europe and Asia where they're not aggressive, right? In their so-called home ranges, they're just part of the community. They get to these new areas, they explode. And so ecologically, that's kind of cool, even if the impact on the environment, not so cool.
Yeah. I mean, what's your estimate as far as how many invasive issues come from human activity?
Oh, I'd say close to 100%. Yeah, really. I mean, again, based on that invasion paradox suggests you should always fail and it succeeds. So why does it succeed? It's because they get a lot of help from us, right? So typically what happens is, from a grassland perspective, let's say, and, grasslands are surprisingly widespread. They're both 30% of the Earth's surface are grasslands. We typically bring seeds from Europe, but also land management from Europe, so-called biological husbandry. And it's the introduction of, say, species from Germany and grazing regimes from Germany over the last several thousand years, that 1-2 punch that allows, when I walk the Austrian Alps, I went for a trip, I was like, all these species are invasive in North America and they're native here. but it's because the seeds and the technologies are transported together. And that's one of the biggest drivers of invasion.
Interesting.
So it solves the invasion paradox because those plants and animals get so much help. They're introduced repeatedly. They're introduced in large numbers. It's like lottery tickets. You're buying tons and tons of lottery tickets. So your odds of eventually winning in terms of a successful invasion are really high.
Yeah. But if there was an example of like a goose that ate a seed and then flew across the Atlantic and pooped it out, there would be like evolution would already kind of incorporate that, but it's the quickness in which in the last few hundred years of ships and planes and stuff that seems to really let invasive species just take off.
Absolutely. Well, what term, I forget, Crosby is the book. It's called ecological imperialism. It basically makes the argument that colonialism, the European colonization of the planet, if you will, was one of the key drivers of invasion. Because it's just to say it's ships, build you out of ships, you get zebra mussels. It's just endless, the number of stories. But colonialism, so to speak, had a big role to play in invasions. Not only invasions of people and culture, but invasions of plants and animals too.
One more strike for colonialism. Just one more.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. The Spanish flu was another example of World War I and all the ability to travel like we did. It's like, well, let's just spread this thing far and wide, on accident.
Well, that's another issue with, globalization is the connectedness of peoples on the planet, right? And that can have economic and cultural benefits, but it can also have these huge consequences for moving things around like the Spanish flu or COVID or cane toads or whatever it might be, right? So our interconnectedness has become a problem for the transportation of some of these challenges.
Seems like a good thing, but in reality, not so nice. That's why I don't travel anymore. I just stay home and I just try to live within my means, grow my own mushrooms, eat,
I think an increasing number of people are trying to do that. They're making conscious choices about things like travel, about where they live, about where they buy food, the so-called 100-kilometer diet. You don't want to buy anything other than what grows within where you live. Things like that are probably, those are important lifestyle choices, I think, that we're going to have to make.
Yeah. And, as a vegan, I got to be honest, it gets so tricky because local and regional is better in a lot of ways. But then again, there are places in West Africa and places in, Greenland or Japan, they survive off of animal protein. And so it's a mixed bag, and
sure.
Tofu is great, but it takes a lot to make it. So not anything right at this moment, but hopefully we're going to, like I said, pivot away.
I'm not a vegan myself, but I've got the sense there's never been more choice than there is now in terms of vegan products, right? Whether it be proteins, nut butters, and there's way more choices than there might have been 20 years ago though, right?
Sure. Absolutely. That's what prompted me to even give it a try because of the products. Like Beyond Burgers was like the methadone of meat, where it's like, all right, I know you're hungry. Here, have this. And just a greasy burger. You put ketchup and mustard on it. I'm happy. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'll pretend like it's hamburger. It's perfectly fine. Perfectly fine. Mm-hmm. But you also studied some was to stability, diversity, dynamics in fire-dependent ecosystems. So what is that?
Well, that's another. So one of the big things in biology, we're concerned about entering a sixth extinction event, right? A massive planetary loss of species. And so one of the big tasks that scientists are facing now is to try to demonstrate that diversity matters for us. It matters for clean air, clean water, and we should protect diversity for our own good. And a lot of research came out of the 1992 Rio Convention for Biodiversity. And I think there was a call to scientists to try and demonstrate it matters, right? And so that's kind of the origins for that type of work, where you're arguing that biodiversity creates more stable and livable environmental systems that benefits people, but benefits the planet generally. Does that make sense? So that's the background to that study, because we show that diversity helped stabilize this area. As part of Western North America, there was a catastrophic fire. Areas at higher native diversity bounced back from that fire far quicker than areas that didn't.
Interesting.
Right? We call it the portfolio effect. It's like a stock market metaphor. The more diverse your portfolio, the more stable your performance is economically over time, right?
Okay.
And species diversity operates identically. So if you've got, let's say, whatever it might be, a grassland system with fire-tolerant species, drought-tolerant species, highly productive species, it's like a carpenter trying to build a house with all your tools. The more tools you have, the more capable you are of building your house. The more stock portfolio, the more rich diversity of stocks, the more stable the performance.
Right.
Exactly the same in the environment. So if you have one species, you've got meltdown and invasion and one dominant species. As long as the environment doesn't change and that one species does okay, you might be okay. But if it switches, then you're in trouble because you've invested totally in Bitcoin. Yeah. And everything else is falling apart. That's exactly the same way it works.
You had to mention that. I lost all my money in the last 3 years because of the damn stock market. I was trying to get in on that whole GameStop. They got me. They cornered me. My portfolio was not diverse enough.
Was not diverse. Well, that's the metaphor for how we think biological diversity can help an climatically unstable, environmentally unstable planet. And that was the focus of that study.
So that would indicate that our agricultural process of monocropping is incredibly stupid.
On two levels. One, we're producing 95% of our food from 3 or 4 plant species. But on a genetic level, of course, as you may know, we've bred our crops to be, for example, highly productive, but not really great at drought tolerance, not really good at defense from pests, right? So because we've bred those, so a plant can only do so much. There's no such thing as a Darwinian demon that is endlessly fecund, prolific in breeding, completely unedible to anything on the planet. And what's the third one? Anyways, you get the idea. A drought tolerance, environmental stress. There's always weaknesses that affect every plant species. We've bred the ability for, say, for example, corn to tolerate drought or to tolerate insect attack, focusing all of its energy on producing corn cobs. But what that means is we have to add pesticides because we've bred out the natural ability of corn to resist being eaten by insects. And we also irrigate because we've bred out the ability of corn to be drought tolerant. And so we've got those monocultures in terms of diversity in the landscape, and we've also got genetic monocultures within our crops that make them vulnerable to the sorts of changes that are unfolding. Yeah. So in the corn example, we've gone back to some of the primitive corn ancestors in places like Mexico to try and get individuals that still have those drought genes, for example, and put them back in corn just because we want to undo the mess that we did before. Modern agriculture has been a miracle. It feeds us, it explains population growth, but it's had these problems that now we have to try and fix, not only for things like drought vulnerability of corn, but also environmental impacts, fertilizer, pollution, you name it.
So in your professional opinion, what is the right answer? Is it molecular biology or is it rediversifying crops and be organic and grow more of a diversity in one field, but do it at scale? Because that seems also highly impossible and improbable to feed the world on, organic farming, as much as I love it,
That's right. So those are the trade-offs we have to face. So there's a few things there. Greater efficiency, don't waste as much food, change the way we eat, maybe eat less, eat more locally. Again, so our innovations since the 1930s, we have more fertilization, we have more mechanization. Breeding has been another major innovation that allowed us to keep ramping up production. As we go forward, we're kind of running out of innovative possibilities. Breeding may be still one that we can pursue, but I think the solution that increasingly is facing us is somehow trying to do with less. Reduce do I need to have strawberries in Canada in the middle of winter? Right. Or kiwis or whatever? I mean, those are the sorts of questions we have to start asking.
I think it's wonderful. It's billions into scientific research, getting on a molecular level, trying to figure, or just have some self-discipline,
Yeah. Well, as with society, so with us individually, right? Moderation is usually the most healthy path.
Yeah. So my doctor keeps telling me, but I keep drinking scotch every night. Yeah. And also, I was talking to a bee guy the other day, and he was telling me, they did the same with honeybees. They saw that here's an aggressive kind of bee who goes out and looks for food harder and faster than others. And so that became the standard. And once again, That's not diversity. And they're also edging out other great bumblebees and all these other kind of wild bees So you also did some research in plant pollinator dynamics and agricultural landscapes. What are the threats with the pollinator declines? What have you found?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. So those earlier things we talked about, like the invasion paradox, are kind of more fundamental ecology. About 10 years ago, we got approached by a farmers organization in Canada called Alice Canada. But they're a farmers-led organization that's interested in environmental sustainability. And they basically said, the CEO, Brian, he said, you guys are publishing these damn papers, but you don't measure anything we actually grow. There's nothing in these papers that can honestly help us be more sustainable. Can you work more directly with us? And I thought that was a great idea. So we started with pollinators, and I got to admit, I'd read the New York Times magazine article on the insect apocalypse. And of course, agricultural landscapes are pretty much bereft of habitat. There's a lot of chemicals, and I thought there's going to be nothing there. It's going to be a biological desert. But we worked on these farms. What they do is they retire these marginal land areas and put in native tallgrass prairie or wetlands or whatever. They're about 2%, 5% of the farm area, relatively small, because they're business people. They don't want to sacrifice crop yield. So we just looked at those areas to see if anything is coming back, and we're shocked to find out that bee diversity doubled, bee abundance tripled as soon as you built these areas. And to me, what the indication is there's actually more going on in these farm landscapes than I might have feared or hoped. And if you build even small amounts of habitat, things come back really, really quickly. So they're hanging on in various edge habitat areas, but there is the capacity to recover somewhat. Mm-hmm. And then we've tried to look at the question, well, how does the bee pollinator diversity on farms compare to regional conservation areas? We didn't see a huge amount of difference. So it's been a bit shocking, actually, a bit of a good news story. Yeah. And we've gone from pollinators to insect communities more broadly, including things like beneficial predators that might eat crop pests. Similarly, found that populations there can be quite large in these restored areas. So that's been kind of a good news story, actually, and a surprise. So we continue to work on that now. We've now transitioned to the things that eat the insects, the birds and the bats, to see how they're responding and whether there's also positive trends.
I always thought the locust outbreaks that happened in West Africa, I'm just like, send a whole truckload of chickens out there and let them just take care of it.
I think that's why the Mormons have the seagull, isn't it, as the sort of one of their big symbolic animals or whatever, because the seagulls ate all the locusts during an early outbreak of pests.
I didn't know
Pretty sure that's a story. Yeah, I think we had to do that in history class when I was a kid.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, where there's a will, there's a way. My wife does organic plant protection, and I have to say, there's amazing things happening there. Just hoping that it all can be brought up to scale, and we can slowly move away from the things. So,
yeah, we work on that too. If these small restored areas can increase populations of parasitoids and the so-called, the lions of the insect world, can they sweep into crop fields and eat the pests and reduce the need or eliminate the need for chemicals? That's one of the things we work on too.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that are really threatening the pollinators? Is it persistent chemicals? Is it just the monocropping itself, the lack of diversity? What do you think?
Well, it's a good question. It appears there's a range of things, right? It's a loss of habitat. It's chemicals, certainly. These parasitic mites and so forth that are associated with honeybee hives, they move over into native bee colonies. That's a problem. I think it's death by 1,000 cuts at this stage. Yeah. Which one of those factors might be most limiting, I'm not sure, but maybe all the above. But right now, after 100 years of intensive agriculture in the regions we work at, there are still a lot of bees, at least.
Good.
So that's hopeful, I think.
Good.
Yeah.
Me not being scientific, all I can do is worry from the sidelines and just think.
Well, this is a problem, right? I mean, I like I said, New York Times had this insect apocalypse story where we're done. Insects provide all these services and we're going to lose them all. And I would get nervous myself. And so it wasn't until we researched that and looked at it, it's like, it doesn't seem to be that bad. But it's really easy to get nervous or scared based on the way the media sometimes portrays science, unfortunately. Even when the intentions are really good to draw our attention to a problem, sometimes it seems it might be a bit much. It's hard to tell.
It's it's like the Hearst days. It's like you have to be tabloid about everything in order to sell news.
Clickbait.
Right. I mean, when we do this podcast, I'm going to have to put some kind of grabby title on it that is probably disingenuous. So.
Well, unfortunately, that's how the system works. I mean, the alternative is, scientists work in anonymity and nobody hears anything about it. And that doesn't seem like a good idea either. So it's a fascinating time right now. We consume a lot of our information from the social media, podcasts such as this, Twitter, whatever it might be. In a way, we have access to information like we've never had before. And I think in the big picture, that's a really good thing. It just puts the pressure on all of us as individuals to sort through all that we hear and try to figure out what we believe or what's the right course of action. That's tricky. But it seems better than before when everything was just 3 news services in America, one storyline, you decide. It feels the complexity ultimately might be healthy for us, but I still get snowed under by the details sometimes myself. So
I think, the stuff is out there now. And if you dig and you'll find it. But the waters are getting murky where it's a lot of shit, And remember when the History Channel first came out and they had really good history stuff?
Yeah,
and
that's right. They did.
A decade later, it's like, did aliens build the pyramids? It's like, man. And they start pandering to the people.
That's right. Absolutely. I've heard that before. Arts and entertainment no longer has arts or entertainment and so forth. MTV no longer has music.
Yeah.
It's interesting how that can work.
Well, that's the objective here for me as a science communicator, is to not dumb it down at all, bring people on that know way more than me, and try my best not to look stupid and try to just get the raw information out there and try to make it entertaining. But at the same time, don't pander to the lowest common denominator while doing it. I think that's why we had the whole reality show boom and everything. It's sad. I miss the Nova documentaries of my grandma used to watch,
Or Nature on PBS.
Right.
I'm not from Canada, but we got all that material as well. Nova, Nature were fantastic.
That was the heyday, Jane Goodall. When I was 6 or 7, I thought this woman's cool.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But you also looked into rodent plagues. What's going on with the little fuzzy critters?
Well, that's also fundamental ecology hitting environmental change. And again, it's part of that predator-prey dynamic on landscapes here. So we've eliminated a lot of our carnivores, right? The big ones are grizzly bear and cougar and so forth in North America. But of course, some of our smaller carnivores like weasels and minks can struggle as well. And what a rodent plague tends to be is when there's nothing eating the rodents, their populations explode, and then they eat every plant in sight. Rodents tend to be selective eaters. So the rodent plague in prairie diversity is they eat everything they like. They leave behind the untasty things. And what the plant community becomes is what the rodents don't eat. And that doesn't happen a lot, but it's becoming increasingly common. Again, the loss of predators, and the 8 places we work to test this, it's mostly weasels and minks and raptors, owls. All those predator populations are declining to varying degrees. Some populations are stable, but their ability to regulate small mammals, rodents, it appears to be limited, and it's leading to these outbreaks, these plagues. And so, they're shaping plant communities. And they're cryptic. They're mostly nocturnal, these rodents. You can't quite see what's going on. So you may not be able to detect the difference unless you look closely. But basically, a lot of grasslands regionally are what those rodents do not eat. The untasty plants. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. What is the remedy then? I mean, what do you do? Just reintroduce owls into an environment? What would you do?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, we're in the UN decade of restoration or whatever it may be, and it recognizes we just can't protect biodiversity by putting a fence around what already is what's left. We have to rebuild. And so there's a lot of restoration efforts globally on wetlands, grasslands, forests, whatever. Oftentimes we emphasize the easy things like plants. So you can have an established plant community that's pretty much empty, bereft of things like predators. So ultimately, if you have a situation like that, you can get rodent plagues. So ultimately the solution is just as you say, introduce owls or small carnivores or whatever. We tend not to think about that as much. It looks like a wetland, so it must be a wetland, but there may be key elements missing within the food web. And predators are usually the last thing to show up, as I described initially.
Yeah. Well, we're predators. Maybe we should learn to have a nice rat on a stick or something.
There you go. Absolutely. Well, I mean, it's a bit of a joke, but in a way, we talk about eating insects now. Cricket powder is increasingly available in grocery stores, and it's the same sort of thing, right? And a lot of people won't eat it because it's like, I'm not eating crickets.
Yeah. No, I don't have any qualms with that. I went to Mexico. They put a little chili powder on them. They're great. But I mean, as far as locusts go, is that an edible thing?
Oh, yeah. No, absolutely. We have in Ontario, Canada, we have at least one company that manufactures the locust powder. It's interesting. With the farmers' work, we work a lot with major grocery chains in Canada. And one of them put a lot of effort into creating very user-friendly, edible locust powder. No one bought it. So this is, we tend to blame corporations a lot, and maybe rightly so in some cases. But consumers have a role too in these sorts of things. Like, we do have to support things like these alternative, potentially friendlier things. You've made a conscious effort to be vegan, but it's not. More of us need to think about what we eat and why we eat what we eat, and think about, I should be okay with locust powder. Apparently it makes great muffins. You can't even tell, right? And so this is another, if we talk ultimately about solutions, it's not just blaming the government or blaming corporations. We also have a responsibility. If no one buys those widgets from that corporation, they're going to stop making those widgets. But, we don't often pay enough attention to consumer choice. So I love that locust powder story where the corporation was trying their best to create this alternative product, and no one bought it.
And I don't think it's for lack of marketing or whatever, because they're good at what they do as far as trying to manipulate the public into buying a certain product with colors and fonts and commercials. So it comes down to something deeper, some kind of cultural issue or something.
Yeah, maybe information, letting people know what choices exist and why it's important to make those choices. Sometimes that's not an easy sell.
And a stigma about insects versus...
Oh, yeah.
Like we love fuzzy creatures. We love cows. We love, but we eat them too. So it's like we only eat things that we find cute.
Yeah. Oh, and there are strong cultural connections. So lobster is a big example. So I'm from Eastern Canada. So when I grew up, I've never had lobster in my life. Lobster was poor people food, because you know what a lobster is, right? They're bottom feeder. Yeah. They're disgusting. And so they were poor people food to my grandmother. So they would be on the beaches back in the 1920s or whatever, in the tidal pools. No one would touch them. No one would eat lobster. It's that's strictly cultural and a stigma. Lobster's obviously apparently amazing, so they tell me. But that's an example of just a transition from one cultural stigma where it's negative to now positive, and it's a desired species.
Nearly everything that you can eat as a cuisine down in New Orleans. I spent a lot of time in New Orleans. Everything is like that. Catfish, po' boys. These sandwiches are called po' boys, poor boys. And it's just a baguette with the, random fish, shrimp, whatever bottom feeder that they could put on thing. Now they're the most expensive thing you can get.
There you go.
And
there you go. Absolutely.
Not so bad. Lobster's okay, but it's just such a strange creature. Now that I'm vegan for like a year, I got, you get a little bit queasy thinking about eating anything that was living. And it's weird because I never thought I'd be like that.
Yeah. No, interesting, eh? Yeah.
Yeah.
Was there a period? There must have been a period of transition where you weren't sure, or were you so willful and determined you're going to make it work?
No. There was moments where I thought, I just want to go get a nice tri-tip,
Yeah,
just forget. And then, but I was stupid enough to sign up to look at a lot of animal cruelty, like you follow Peter on Twitter or something. You're gonna you get reminded why it's important to make certain sacrifices and stuff. The vegan thing is tough. We talked about locality of food and everything, but beyond that, the environmental impacts of beef and versus some of the other proteins and stuff really was another huge selling point for me.
Yeah. No, it's a challenge. So when I was a kid, we had chicken once a month. Like, it was a treat. And now, I forget the exact statistics, but I think 100 years ago, it took an average farmer something like 2 full weeks of time to go from collecting the eggs, raising the hens, to producing the mature chicken to eating it. So it was like 2 weeks. Now it's 14 minutes. These so-called broiler sheds can mass produce chicken at such an incredible rate. It's actually quite environmentally efficient. But they're just, they're bred for meat size. The chicken has a horrible life.
Right,
it's incredibly efficient, right? So the energy has shifted. So now chicken is so readily available. But as a kid, it was rare. Same with meat. We had ground beef and that was it. Never had steak. I never had steak till I was in my 20s.
That's hilarious.
So, yeah. Oh, Yeah, I mean, you could also call it pathetic, but my family was like that.
Yeah.
My mom in particular was, vigilant on the cost of food. And, she was into nuts and lentils in the 70s before it was
Oh,
cool.
yeah, that sounds
Yeah.
cool. What a cool
Except,
lady.
yeah, well, unless you're a teenager in that house, then it's not so cool. But there you go.
Mom, all the other kids are having steak.
She's going to watch this as well, so they better be careful.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the message is care about what you eat, think about what you eat, be conscious about what you're consuming. Yeah. The nutrition is also another factor where you think, well, I need to buy my omega-3s, and science is catching up to tell us more and more what is it that we need. Along with, soil health has been a big thing where just in the last, 20 years, we figured out stuff we never knew.
Now, that's kind of a new frontier in sort of, the biological sciences is soil microbial processes, carbon storage, the whole thing. It's endlessly fascinating.
Super fascinating. You had a fungi on yesterday. Amazing conversation. And the mycorrhizal fungi. So cool. Well,
one of the invasion stories is the invasive pine. I think it's New Zealand, where the pine was introduced and it wouldn't grow. But until they figured out that they need the mycorrhizal fungi partner, then it grew like crazy to the point it got invasive. But that's how dependent the tree was on the soil fungi to make a living.
When did that happen?
Oh, the study was 20, 30 years ago. The introduction was sometime in the mid-1900s, I would guess.
Oh, but they were struggling up until that point to figure out how.
Oh, it wouldn't grow. It wouldn't grow. That's right. So it needed that fungal partner. Yep.
Those are the things that give you hope to say, well, we just figured out this really massive, really important, obvious thing. There might be we might be able to solve some of our problems after all.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'll ask you one last question, and then we'll talk afterwards. What is the outlook, in your professional opinion, for biodiversity and the fate of the human race?
Oh, big question.
Well, it's an important one.
It is a very important question. It's what it's all about, really, at this stage. I think we'll be fine. Humanity will be fine. What's at risk is quality of life. The way we live, especially in the global north, the affluent, industrialized societies. That's under risk, I would suggest, because we have to change the way we support ourselves. We make our living. Humanity will always, I think, can withstand this no problem, but it's the population structure that we have right now, the level of affluence, that's the biggest risk, the biggest uncertainty. I think we do have to change. And science hopefully will play a big role in that. And so that's the big uncertainty, but also I think the great hope. If there are solutions from diet to whatever it might be. But so I'm optimistic but concerned, with the biggest risk again being, I don't know if lifestyle is the right word, but
modern comforts, modern conveniences and luxuries.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's tremendous affluence right now on the planet, in face of incredible poverty, malnutrition in sub-Saharan Africa. There's a lot of food right now. If there's 800 million to 1 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa that are malnourished, it's more of a food distribution problem now than it is a food production one globally. There's inequality and all sorts of things. So we're doing pretty good. It's just we have a lot of waste. We have a lot of so-called pollution, byproducts that are harmful for the environment, and a lot of inequality.
Yeah.
So those are the big challenges that everyone knows. That's what the United Nations is there for, to think about those things and try to help out. That's the next big step, I think, of where we're going to go. So the future, where the future of humanity is, I think, will depend on how we navigate those processes going forward, those challenges.
So when these international institutions pontificate about food security, it's not really, it's more of colonial jibber jabber, when in reality it's a food distribution issue. Is that right?
That's part of it for sure. We still, we waste 20 to 30% of our nitrogen fertilizer each year. It just washes off. It's meant 100% to support plant growth, but, we tend to apply fertilizer in the winter, early spring, when there's no plants growing, so it gets washed downstream. So that's an example. For food production, 25% of all the greenhouse gases on the planet are produced from agriculture. Carbon, but also nitrous oxide. So it's not just distribution that's an issue. It's how we grow the food. And again, the inefficiencies and waste. Farms are very leaky. Water pollution, these hypoxic dead zones in places like the Baltic Sea and the Gulf of Mexico. That's fertilizer washing off the farms, not being taken up by the plants, creating these nutrient-rich waters that then become oxygen deprived. So it's distribution, but it's also impact. We have to think about all those things at once.
You mentioned nitrous oxide, is that right? So
N2O, yeah.
So does this just from the sun? Does the fertilizer evaporate into the air?
Well, effectively, that's how you can describe it. It's turning from a solid nitrogen fertilizer into a gaseous form. Okay. So 70% of all greenhouse gas emissions by agriculture are nitrous oxide, with carbon a relatively small component that comes more from energy production and so forth. But yeah, the three big greenhouse gases are carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, and methane. And of course, methane comes from agriculture as well, with things like cattle production, right?
Yeah.
So distribution is one of many problems.
Yeah. But, all I'm here to do is champion biodiversity and diversity in all forms, really, because, I heard a scientific study the other day. In a science labs that are more diverse culturally.
Oh, sure.
Are more productive. And so
right.
It's just every aspect of everything in nature and biology and the world that has diversity seems to always be better, stronger, more productive, etc.
Well, absolutely. I think the cultural diversity is a big one too, because, most scientific research happens in the global north. A disproportionately large percentage of discovery comes from Europe and North America or Australia, whatever it might be. China, increasingly, their science system is fantastic, but it's leaving people behind in other regions. The problems we face are global. If science comes up with solutions that can't just be applied to North America, they have to have the global community involved, including people from, say, parts of Africa going, here are the problems that are affecting us. They're not the same problems you have in North America, but they need to be addressed equally. We need that sort of global community conversation within science, within politics, pretty much everything.
This is why I'm against a lot of that proprietary technology, and we're going to keep this. We're going to play our cards close to our chest, and you just have to figure it out on your own. That's terrible. It's a terrible way to run science.
Yeah. Well, one of the disappointments I've had with things like the conflict in the Ukraine is that we have urgent issues right now as a global community over environmental degradation. Yeah, food insecurity in certain places, quality of life, climate. These things are pressing issues such that squabbling over borders is... It's
stupid.
I would like to think it's past its prime. It's stupid. It's no longer, and so that's what's so disappointing. So that's the biggest both hope and also concern about the ability of the global community to pull together and tackle some of these issues.
I think behind it all, and underneath the surface, people like you, people like me, we're concerned with living a life that's not about the consolidation of power or the accumulation of wealth. It's different. We have a different baseline considerations, and there are just people that are in charge who unfortunately think differently.
Well, it's interesting traveling the world sometimes is that most people I encounter feel identical.
Right.
It's quite a shared story about the importance of global community and about lifestyle balance and all these sorts of things. In fact, it's rare that I encounter someone that doesn't feel that way. So it gets to your...
the rich people are like a monolith, but just because they're not a monolith doesn't mean that they don't have all the power, which is a funny thing. I always tell this anecdote. I say, if a monkey took all the bananas from all the rest of the monkeys and hoarded them for himself and didn't let the monkeys have, science would be trying to figure out, well, what's wrong with him? Why is he all messed up in the head? Why is he so psychotic and sociopathic? And in the case of humans, we put him on the cover of Forbes magazine, give him a round of applause.
There you go. Exactly.
Value system. Values need to change, but empathy. All right.
Yeah.
Well, wonderful human being, Andrew MacDougall, PhD, ecology, environmental science down there at University of Guelph. I'd say up there in Canada. Anything you want to add before we go?
No, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have you come back because it was way too awesome to talk with you. You're a great communicator.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, wave goodbye to everybody, and then we'll sign off and we'll talk after. Bye, everybody. Thanks for coming.